The morning at Prospect Ridge began with a strange silence. Normally, the wind moved through the canyon with a steady whistle, and the cattle in the fields made their noise as usual, but this time there was a pause in the air. Grace Harper noticed it first as she stood outside the town's small museum. She held her shawl tighter around her shoulders and raised her eyes to the horizon. Dust was moving in the distance, not the kind kicked up by grazing animals, but the heavy kind that came when armored wagons and metal boots pressed the ground flat. Inside the museum, the old relic sat quiet and forgotten. The Gatling gun rested behind thick glass, its barrels gleaming faintly even in the weak sun that slipped through the windows. It had not been fired for more years than anyone in town could count, but its shape carried a warning. The brass plates had dulled and the wood on the grip had worn smooth with age, as if 1,000 hands had turned it before. Cole Maddox stepped into the museum with dust on his boots and his hat in hand. He moved with a steady gait, each step measured. His face was hard from years of labor in the fields, but not unkind. He stopped near Grace and eyed the relic. "Funny thing," he said in a slow tone. "How something built so long ago can still spark thoughts in the men who see it." Grace looked back at him with a serious face. "This time it may have to do more than spark thoughts." Cole turned his head toward the window as the sound of engines rolled closer. At first it came like faraway thunder, but soon it grew into a steady clamp and whine of marching lines. The Empire riders and soldiers were making their way into Prospect Ridge. At the lead of the column rode Commander Silas Cade. He sat tall in his saddle, coat pressed and clean, his gloves polished as if they belonged at a parade rather than a frontier settlement. His men followed with rifles tucked at their sides, and behind them rolled transports marked with the crown of the Empire. The faces of the townspeople grew pale as the troops stopped in the main square. Cade looked down at the gathered crowd and lifted his chin. His voice carried with practiced ease. "You will deliver your grain and door to the Empire within 3 days. The tax is doubled, and payment in full is required. Those who fail will lose land, tools, and more." Murmurs spread like sparks in dry grass. Mothers pulled their children closer. Old men shook heads slowly. Cole said nothing but clenched his fist at his side. Just then a pair of ranch hands appeared, pushing the relic Gatling on a wheeled cart. It rattled along the ground until it rested plain in sight of Cade and his troops. The commander's stern mouth bent into mocking laughter. He circled it from horseback, gesturing at its barrels with a hand so clean it looked as if he had never touched real work in his life. His officers laughed as well, the sound carrying sharp across the silent town. "A toy," Cade said, leaning down. He reached for the crank and spun it once. The barrels spun lazily, clicking with empty rhythm. "This is what you bring to resist the Empire? Hand crank and rusted parts?" His men's laughter rose at his words. Grace kept her gaze on him, unbending. Cole's eyes never left the relic. He stepped closer, rested his work-worn hand upon the edge of the cart, and felt the weight of history in the cold metal. "A toy can still bite when handled right," Cole whispered, his voice low enough for Grace alone to hear. The commander gave his order one last time and turned his column away. His men rode out of the square, laughter still echoing between the walls of wood and stone. The dust they left behind stuck to the air, leaving the town flat and quiet again. Cole kept his hand on the crank after they left.
Else.
He could feel the balance of the barrels and the simple truth of motion and strength. His eyes narrowed as he thought of the field where stone could break under pressure and men could be cut, bowed down by rain, in the form of lead. Grace saw something in his look, and though the fear in her chest still pressed hard, she allowed herself a single breath of calm. She knew what he meant without more words. That relic might yet carry their hope. The town remained silent for a long time, as if the sigh of the Empire still hung in the air. Finally, Cole lowered his hand, nodded once to Grace, and walked back into the square where children clung to their mothers. The day would not end with laughter from strangers. The day would end with the thought of a relic that could still wake again. Wordless Grace turned back to the museum, knowing the coming nights would no longer be spent in sleep, but in preparation. The sun slipped low behind the cliffs as Prospect Ridge gathered in the barn near the river. The barn smelled of hay, oil, and smoke, but it now held more than animals and tools. In the center, upon heavy wheels, rested the old Gatling gun brought from the museum. Its barrels caught the flicker of lantern light, and its size seemed larger within the narrow wooden walls. People stood in a circle, eyes wary, each face carrying both fear and a spark of resolve. Nicole Maddox leaned on the gun carriage. His sleeves were rolled up and his palms were raw from the crank he had tested. The line in his jaw was set firm. Grace Harper was beside him with a book in her hand. The book's pages were torn and stained, an instruction manual from a time none of them lived through. She had spent the afternoon reading aloud strange words and numbers to make sense of the old design. Owen Drake, the town's blacksmith and known for his strong arms, crossed his arms and studied the weapon with care. "It will fire," he said as he shifted his weight forward. "But if we want it to stand against the Empire's rifles, we must shape it stronger." Eli Collins, younger and more restless, carried a box of tools. He set them down and said, "I can rework the barrels. They're still true. But if we polish and ease the chamber, it will breathe better. The crank movement will be smoother too." Ava Bell, who worked mixing powders at the mine, spoke with hands marked by grit. "I can prepare clean charges, which powder burns steadier. Less smoke, less risk of the gun choking when the air grows thick." Ben Carter had been quiet until then. But when he touched the spent shells that had been left in the storage chest, his mind already worked. "I can machine new rounds, longer, sharper, with jackets that do not break apart. We have ore in the ridge, and I still know how to cast and press." Riley Monroe, the fastest runner in town, leaned against the wall with her hands in her pockets. She was young but sharpened. "If you get it to fire, it still needs to move. We cannot hold the square against their walkers. If you give it wheels and crafts to hide behind, I can find places to position and pull." Grace held the book tighter and read again. She explained the feat of the belt and the turn of the crank. Words felt stiff in her mouth as she spoke them, but Cole listened and understood. His hands had known plows, ropes, and gears the same way. He could turn and press as steady as a clock. That night, they worked by lantern. Eli polished the barrels until they gleamed, sweat beading across his brow. Ben cut strips of brass by measure and pressed them into new shells. Ava mixed careful powders in small tins, holding down her hair each time she opened the lids. Riley dragged in canvas ropes and spare wagon wheels, then hammered a cradle that could roll the gun across rough ground. He also bent steel mounts for a new drum magazine. They could not load forever by hand strips, not in battle.
Ow.
The drum's mouth gleamed with teeth that would feed rounds, one after another. Grace read every page she could and marked lines with charcoal. Cole turned the crank slow and steady, listening for flaws in the spin. Each time the barrels aligned, he pictured the field and the noise that would soon come. The night grew cold, but no one stopped. When the lantern smoke grew thick, Owen opened the barn doors wide. The cool air of midnight spread inside. Stars watched from above as the people worked. By the hour before dawn, the Gatling stood different. Its barrels polished bright, its feet strong, its wheels greased, and its heart awake. At last, silence filled the barn. Everyone looked at it with both fear and pride. Cole laid his blistered palm against the grip. Grace's voice broke the stillness. "When they return, they will see more than a toy." Owen gave a low grunt that was part laugh, part warning. "Then let them come. They will know this old storm still breathes." The people left the barn in ones and twos, faces shadowed, but eyes alive. The relic stood ready, waiting for the morning when it would speak again. The town, once small and quiet, now carried the heart of steel and fire beneath its wooden beams. The third morning broke with a red sky, and the dust of moving columns rose at the horizon. Prospect Ridge stood quiet, except for the echo of a distant bell. The families had already left for the hills, and only the willing stood at the mouth of Stonebreak Ridge, where the narrow ground bent inward and formed a choke point. The old Gatling sat in the center beneath a canvas cover, wheels locked in place. Cole Maddox stood behind it, hands wrapped in cloth, eyes waiting on the road where the Empire would come. Grace Harper was at his side with a drum magazine ready, lips pressed tight as if she was steadying her own fear with silence. The sound of engines and boots drew stronger until the Empire column showed clear. Wagons rolled in line, walkers pressed the earth with heavy steps, and soldiers in their armor walked with rifles ready. At the lead rode Commander Silas Cade once again, his coat clean as if the last meeting had not touched him in the least. He looked at the narrow pass and the quiet townfolk standing in its mouth, and his lips stretched into a smile. His voice carried cold across the ridge. 3 days I gave you. Show me now your tribute, or I will take what I please. No one answered. Owen Drake stood to one side with axe in hand. Riley waited along the slope where brush and rope had been set. Eli, Ava, and Ben crouched near the carts, each with tools and fresh rounds ready for the gun. The silence was so thick that even the stamping of horses sounded too loud. Cade's gaze fell on the covered shape in the center. He raised a brow and laughed in open scorn. So the toy again? Do you believe canvas will make it less of a joke? Lifted his hand and waved for the column to advance. The moment his glove moved, Owen dropped his own hand. The canvas cover slid free, and the old Gatling shone in the weak sun, its barrels pointed sharp into the choke of soldiers. Cole gripped the crank, his wrists tight, waiting for Grace's voice. Now, she said. Cole turned the handle, slow at first, then faster. The barrel spun, and with a roar like thunder, the gun woke. Slugs raced through the morning air. A storm of iron tore into the shields of the Empire line. At first the armor plates flashed with their field of protection, bright ripples spreading across their fronts. But the storm did not stop. Round after round struck in a constant stream, piling weight against the defense until the screens bent and failed. Soldiers staggered, their armor crushed. Cora shuddered as joints burst under metal rain. The steady rhythm of the crank was like a drum, filling the ridge with a music of war no memory could forget. Grace fed the drum with steady hands, shells clinking as empties fell over the ground. Eli cried out in triumph as the streams cut down the front ranks. Riley pulled the rope in her hand, triggering the traps laid the night before. Steel cables snapped tight, catching a walker leg and pulling it sideways. The heavy machine pitched to the ground in a crunch of dust and iron, and the Gatling's line chewed into its exposed knee joint until it lay broken. Cade shouted orders, face sharp with sudden anger. He called for heavy rifles and signaled for the rear guards to push forward. But smoke filled the passage as Ben's mixture burned, and the rifles found only shifting shadows. The storm of slugs raked across them faster than commands could spread. Shields collapsed under pressure, men fell, and the order of the column faltered. For the first time, Commander Cade's laughter was gone. He lifted his sword and tried to rush the line, his horse pounding forward through the haze. Cole did not stop turning the crank. His arms burned and sweat stung his eyes, but his resolve did not break. Grace shouted above the storm, pointing, and Cole swung the barrels toward the charge. A hail of iron met the rider and left the proud coat and bright sword sprawled upon the dust. His men froze for a breath at the sight before dragging him away. The Empire line wavered. Signals failed in the smoke. Drones that guided them fell from the sky like glass birds struck from above. Confusion spread, and then retreat followed. Within the choke of Stonebreak Ridge, the people of Prospect Ridge did not cheer. They only stood in the heat of powder smoke and the echo of thunder. Cole slowed the crank and let the barrels draw to a stop. His palms bled against the cloth wrappings, and his chest rose heavy with the weight of battle. Grace's hair was tangled with dust, her hands black from powder. Owen lowered his axe. Riley breathed fast but wore a grin. Eli, Ava, and Ben looked upon the wreckage, eyes wide at the proof that their work had held. The Empire was gone from the ridge for now, leaving behind broken steel and the memory of defeat. The old Gatling stood silent again, but its new voice had been heard. The people of Prospect Ridge knew the fight had only begun, yet in their hearts burned the knowledge that they had not. Bent they had struck, and they had proved laughter could turn to fear when old iron spoke with fire. The news of the Empire's loss reached every corner of the frontier by the time the sun had set on the battle at Stonebreak Ridge. Fires still smoldered on the field, the smell of smoke carried on the wind, but the townspeople were not fooled into thinking it was over. They knew the Empire did not forget defeat, and knew a greater force would return. In the barn once again, the people gathered. The Gatling stood in the middle, barrels dark from heat, its wheels stained with dust. Cole Maddox sat on a crate near it, his hands wrapped in bandages. He said little, but his eyes held steady fire. Grace Harper leaned against a post with her notebook. Owen Drake sharpened an axe, though he knew it would not meet steel the same way as bullets. "They will come back with more," Owen said, without lifting his eyes. His words carried like iron laid upon the floor. "We must make ready," Grace replied. "We cannot depend on one fight to turn them forever." Ben Carter placed a row of newly made rounds on the table. We will not hold them with only this gun. We need more barrels, more hands, more storm. Eli Collins nodded. Give me iron and time, and I will build more mounts. They will not look pretty, but they will spin and fire. Ava Bell tapped a small wooden box filled with her newest powder. I can mix stronger loads, enough to keep the weight of fire heavy, but light enough to carry. Riley Monroe lifted her head with a spark in her eye. Then we take the fight to the plains, not in the square. Open ground will give us room to dance around their walkers. We can use wagons, carts, anything that rolls. Hide the guns under canvas until it is time. The circle of people nodded. Plans began to take shape. They worked quickly, not stopping as the nights passed. Wagon mounts were made from farm carts. Steel was bent and hammered into crude turrets. The smell of oil and fire powder became the air of Prospect Ridge. Grace spent her hours teaching new hands how to feed the drums and belts. Children no older than 12 watched but did not touch, their eyes wide at the work. Cole trained farmers and ranchers in holding the line, teaching them how to move by signals when voices would be lost in thunder. Owen built a bell rack that could guide lines through sound across the open plain. Every hammer strike, every cut of metal carried the rhythm of survival. When the Empire returned, it was no longer just one column. An entire legion poured across the frontier. Fields trembled beneath the weight of armored carriers. Walkers marched side by side like iron beasts, banners flying tall. Admiral Lyle Benton commanded this time. His face was grim and his line perfect as he drove his troops into Vesper Plains, the wide-open field the settlers had chosen. The Empire advanced with shields locked in front, rifles raised, riders at the edges to sweep any small resistance. Benton believed victory was certain. His men had trained for order, taught to depend on the Crown's endless supply of iron. Then the tarps were pulled. 30 wagon guns rose from the plain, barrels already spinning. Cole stood at the center, Grace at his side, feeding the drum. Owen stood on a cart above the line, hands on the rope that held the signal bell. The sound of the first strike of the bell rang across the plain. The Gatlings answered. A storm of iron streaked the sky. The shields of the Empire burned bright but could not hold against the constant stream. They flickered, bent, and broke. Walkers stumbled. Drones above blinked and fell from Riley's traps of mirrored glass and smoke that turned sight into blindness. Ava's powder burned clean, keeping the line clear. Ben's long rounds struck true, piercing through joints and seams. The people of Prospect Ridge moved as one body. When the Empire pushed forward, the wagons shifted, guided by Owen's bell. When the Empire spread out to flank, Riley and her riders pulled ropes and toppled stakes that pulled walkers off balance. Cole turned his crank steady, each motion strong, sweat running down his face. Grace kept the drums loaded, her eyes never straying, though fear pressed her heart hard. The battle stretched until dust choked the field and metal lay piled. Still the sound of barrels turning ruled the ground. Benton tried to command retreat with order, but his lines faltered. Columns broke into scattered units. The soldiers pulled back, leaving men and machines behind. When the dust cleared, the people still stood, their wagons braced, their faces covered in soot and grit, but unbroken. Benton's legion pulled from Vesper Plains with grim silence, a silence heavier than laughter. The Empire had seen the storm's full reach. Prospect Ridge did not cheer. They only stood by their wagons as the wind carried the smell of powder away. For they all knew the fight was not finished. And far in the Capitol halls, the Queen herself would hear of the storm that rose from old iron and the will of simple hands. The smoke had cleared from Vesper Plains, but the people of Prospect Ridge did not return to their quiet lives. They knew the Empire would send more. Victory had bought them time and courage, yet everyone felt the weight of what would come next. The wrecks of Empire wagons and broken walkers lay across the field like fallen giants. Men and women moved among them, gathering tools, shells, and food, dropped in retreat. Nothing would be wasted. Cole Maddox stood near the old Gatling, his hands still wrapped but steady. He did not speak much. His eyes stayed fixed, toward the horizon. Grace Harper worked beside him as always, her notebook tucked in her coat, her brown hair tangled, but her gaze calm. Together they watched as wagons rolled back into town, each with its wheels heavy from captured iron. In the following days, speeches rose from every corner of Prospect Ridge. Some wanted to march farther, to strike before the Empire could return. Others asked to dig deeper shelters, to prepare for a long war. Owen Drake, his heavy arms crossed, told them forward or back no longer mattered. He said they had to stand proud in open daylight, with weapons that could roar when needed, but with heads still raised as people and not as shadows. It was not long before a different sound touched the air of the valley. No engines, no rifles, but simple wheels and hooves. A long black carriage rolled down to the riverbank, guarded by a small troop. With it came Queen Helena Rowan herself, dressed not in crown or silk, but in a long dark coat. She stepped down to the river stone with tired grace, her voice carrying clear as if the water worked in her favor. "I am Helena Rowan, queen by law and consent," she said. "I come because blood should not drown more fields. I have seen reports. I know what was done here. I do not laugh." The people held still, hands near their tools and rifles, eyes not soft. Cole rested one hand on the grip of the Gatling. Grace walked forward and stood where stone met water. "You sent men to take our crops," she said, her voice strong and plain. "You sent men to raise taxes so high that families would starve. We did not start this. We only stood where we live. When you bring chains, we break them." The Queen's eyes did not turn away. She took another step closer. "It is true. My commander mocked you. My officers saw you as tools. They forgot law as nothing if it eats the very people who build it. You struck back, and you proved them wrong." Behind her, Admiral Benton watched from the carriage seat. His face carried no pride, only the sharp lines of a man who had known defeat but survived to remember it. Grace looked toward him, then back to the Queen. "If you will keep sending men, we will keep answering. We found strength no one remembered, found a storm in iron and wood, and now we know we can stand." The Queen lifted her gloved hand slowly, then held it steady in the air between them. "I ask for peace, not from fear, but from need. Order must serve the people. I offer a charter. Your towns will keep your land, keep your tools, and keep the right to defend what you raise. Tribute will be fair by measure, not by sword. In return, you stand in the realm as free men and women, not as subjects to be mocked." The crowd stirred. Owen's heavy hand dropped to his side. Ben, Eli, Ava, and Riley exchanged long glances. Cole said nothing, but his palm pressed against the crank of the Gatling, as if testing the weight of the choice. Grace met the Queen's eyes, and at last reached out to take her hand. The small guard shifted, but no guns fired. The air held still a long moment, as if even the river waited. The agreement was silent at first, sealed only by the clasp of hands between two women who had no laughter left but carried will enough to shape the days ahead. Cade, the once proud commander, stood under guard at the edge. He lifted his chin, yet did not speak. He had tasted the storm of iron and carried it with him now, as a scar no doctor could lift. He would face judgment not by the barrel, but by the law he had broken. News spread quick across the frontier. The tale grew as tales must. People whispered that once the Empire had laughed at an old gun, and then the laughter had turned to silence. They said a crank spun by rough hands had broken a legion. They said courage had risen like thunder. Back in the museum, the Gatling returned to its case, though now the glass was fit with a hinge. It stood not as a dead piece, but as a watchful guard. Grace wrote a small sign and placed it before the pedestal. The words were plain. This was once a relic. Then it became a voice. Its song reminded us who we are. Cole often returned in quiet hours. He would place his bandaged palm on the glass and remember the turning of the crank. The sound of thunder no longer filled the air, but in his mind it lingered, not as fear, but as strength. Outside, children ran and laughed again, their voices answering where silence once stood. The storm of iron had passed, but the will it had woken stayed strong in every heart of Prospect Ridge.